Wonderful. Ooh. It's lovely to see all of you. It feels very loud. Is that very loud? It's okay. I'm sure Brian can turn me down if I'm too loud. If you don't know me, I'm Andrew McNeil, and I go to this church. I'm also a psychologist at Queen's University, and I've been invited by Caroline to come along and give a few talks relating to apologetics. Last time we talked about the cosmological argument, and this time we're talking about the argument from design. Is there a designer who's made the world, the universe that we actually live in? Yes, is obviously the answer that I'm going to give. But sometimes we look at the world around us and we see all kinds of strange patterns. Sorry, I was leaning on a wire there and I felt my head being pulled back. Sometimes we see all of these strange patterns in the world. It's doing it again. Right, there we go. We're okay now. Yes. And we see all of these strange patterns in the world around us. We might make our toast in the morning, and we take it out and we see a face in the toast. We might look at the clouds in the sky and see people's faces or objects. We might look at a stump of wood and see a pattern in it that looks like somebody looking back at us. And in all of these things, we find them very amusing precisely because we know that they're not actually designed by anybody. They're just strange flukes of nature. And then sometimes we come across things which we are convinced must be designed. Back in the 1980s, there was a spate of things called crop circles. I don't know whether farmers still find crop circles these days, but they were basically these circles that they would find in their fields where the grain would all be trampled down. And some people suggested, well, maybe these were just strange natural occurrences, but as they developed, they became increasingly elaborate, and it became apparent that these kinds of patterns weren't just random occurrences. Somebody must have put them there. Some people said that maybe it was aliens. Other people said it was human activity. Either way, people were convinced that there was design around it. And when it comes to the world around us, many thinkers have pointed out that both the physical and the biological world that we live in appear to have been carefully designed. It looks like it's been made for the existence of life, and specifically our life. And if that's the case, then it's reasonable to say that there is a designer who's actually made it all. And given that this designer must be intelligent and must be powerful enough to create everything that we see around us, then the logical conclusion is that this designer is God. Now, if we want to put that argument formally, we would put it like this. We would say that the apparent fine-tuning of the universe that we see around us, it either happened by chance, necessity, or by purposive design. Well, we're going to argue that the apparent fine-tuning of the universe didn't happen by chance, and it didn't happen by necessity. It didn't need to be this way. And therefore, what I'm going to argue is that the fine-tuning of the universe happened by purposive design. There's a designer that made it the way it is. And I'm going to unpack that as we go through this talk. But this isn't a new argument. It's been around for a long time. And one of the most memorable ways it was put was back in 1802 by this guy, William Paley, who was a Christian philosopher. And he says, in crossing a heath, suppose I pitched my foot against a stone and were asked how the stone came to be there. I might possibly answer that for anything I knew to be the contrary, it had lain there forever. Nor would it perhaps be very easy to show the absurdity of this answer. But suppose I had found a watch upon the ground, and it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. I should hardly think of the answer I'd given before, that for anything I knew, the watch might have always been there. There must have existed at some time and at some place or other an artificer or artificers who formed the watch. Every indication of contrivance, every manifestation of design which existed in the watch exists in the works of nature, with the difference on the side of nature of being greater or more, and that in a degree which exceeds all computation. Now, he's speaking very flowery language, as you did back in those days, but basically he's saying, if you find a watch on the ground, you're not going to think it's been there forever. You might think that about a stone, but not a watch. You're going to think that somebody has made that watch. And it's had an intelligent designer. And he says that if that's the case for a watch that you found in the ground, how much more is that the case when you look at the world around us, you see the way that it's so finely tuned? Should you not come to the conclusion that there is a designer behind it all? Well, that seems like a very compelling argument. Not everyone has been convinced by that over the years, especially not this guy, Charles Darwin. And he specifically mentions Paley, and he says the old argument of design in nature as given by Paley, which formerly seemed to me so conclusive, fails now that the law of natural selection has been discovered. We can no longer argue, for instance, that the beautiful hinge of a bivalve shell must have been made by an intelligent being, like the hinge of a door by man. There seems to be no more design in the variability of organic beings in the action of natural selection than in the course which the wind blows. Everything in nature is the result of fixed laws. So he's saying all of this happened because it just happened by chance. It had to follow these particular laws, and there's no need to invoke a designer. He says that there might be things which look designed in nature, but that's just the way it looks, because things have just adapted to their environments. And because they've adapted to their environment, it looks like they've been perfectly designed to fit that environment. So he's saying there is no watchmaker, there's just natural laws. But the question for us is whether or not this holds water. Is it so easy for us to write off the idea of a designer and say that there isn't a designer? Well, we're going to have to pause that thought a little bit and come back to it, because before we think about how we might answer Darwin, we need to look not only at the biological world, but we need to look at the physical world around us and see the evidence of fine-tuning and design so that we can actually come back at him and say, look, there is a designer. There is good reason to believe that this world is designed carefully. And this idea that the world around us, the universe we live in, has been finely tuned to support life, finely designed, is something which Scripture itself affirms. So we turn to Psalm 19, for example, and the psalmist, he writes, "The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they display knowledge. There's no speech or language where their voice is not heard. Their voice goes out into all the earth, their words to the ends of the world." And so for the psalmist, it's not just the biological world that gives evidence that we live in a finely tuned universe. It's the physical world. It's the world of nature around us. As we look at it and see the majesty of the starry heavens, then we've got to see that this has all been carefully designed. And the psalmist says that this is like speech pouring forth. People might live in parts of the world where they've never read a Bible, where they've never heard Scripture being read, but they hear this voice coming to them, this voice telling them that there is a designer who has made everything. And so there's no word that can escape this visual message from God. But we're going to dig into the kinds of evidence that we've got in the world around us, that it's finely tuned. And I want to pick 3 examples. And I'm not going to go into them in great detail. You can do that if it's your kind of thing. But I want to just summarize very briefly why these give evidence for us of the fine-tuning of the universe. I want to talk about gravity. I want to talk about the strong nuclear force. And I want to talk about the position of the Earth. Well, let's talk first of all about gravity. Gravity, you know what it is. It's the thing you experience when it brings you down to Earth all the time. And gravity is that force that exists between all objects. And it varies depending on the mass of the object. Bigger objects have more gravitational pull, smaller objects have smaller gravitational pull. And this is a gravitational constant. That constant is fixed throughout the universe. But we've got to ask ourselves a question: what if that gravitational constant was slightly different? If that gravitational constant, that force that exists between all objects in the universe, if it were slightly stronger, then the force between objects would be stronger. And, well, to take one example, stars would have this force pulling in on them much, much stronger than it is, and they would burn out much more quickly and would burn hotter, making life around them simply impossible. And there would be solar explosions from these stars, which are being sucked by this strong gravitational force. In short, our sun would be too dangerous for life. But if this gravitational constant were actually smaller, then stars, they wouldn't form, or they would form and they would just be very dim, and that wouldn't provide the light that we need in our world. Heavy elements like carbon and oxygen wouldn't form because they form through what's known as nucleosynthesis within the star. And planets wouldn't stay in orbit. They would go spinning off into space. So imagine you live in a world which is orbiting the sun, and because the gravitational constant isn't strong enough, then planets would just go spinning off into space. Earth would just spin away from its star. We would not be able to survive in such a universe. And what happens if one constant, the gravitational constant, changes ever so slightly is that life becomes unsustainable throughout the whole universe, never mind our world. And life exists because that one constant is precisely tuned. But it's not just that one constant. There's other constants, many of these constants, which are so finely tuned to support life. So take the strong nuclear force, for example. You know that at the center of an atom is a little nucleus. And in that nucleus, you can see an example here, it's comprised of protons and neutrons. Protons are positively charged. So you know what it's like if you get a magnet and you get the two positive ends and you push them against each other and you can feel that force which is repelling them from one another. Well, protons, because they're positively charged, are pushing away from each other. They want to repel each other, and the thing that glues them together is this strong nuclear force, which only exists in this very tiny space of the nucleus of the atom. And if that strong nuclear force was different from what it actually is, then either certain elements wouldn't form, so oxygen wouldn't be able to form, or these elements, if the strong nuclear force was too strong, then it would create lots and lots of elements like helium and not enough oxygen. And the point is that if you vary this strong nuclear force, you simply cannot produce enough oxygen in the universe, enough oxygen in our world for human beings to actually survive. So again, we need not only gravity to be constant within these very finely tuned limits, but we need this strong nuclear force to be within these very precise limits, or life is not possible. Or take another one, take the position of the Earth. The distance of the Earth from the sun means that we have got seas on our planet. If the Earth was closer to the sun, then these seas would vaporize. If the Earth was further away from the sun, these seas would become ice. Either way, life would not be suitable for human beings. And again, because the Earth exists in a near circular orbit around the sun, this means that our seasons are pretty much constant. If we existed in an elliptical orbit, so if it was like this kind of like shape where it's closer in some seasons and further away in other seasons, well, it would mean that, again, life would be unsustainable because your certain seasons, like your summertime, would be so hot everybody would die, and then other seasons it would be so cold everyone would die. Again, life would simply be unsustainable. And all of this fine-tuning, I've just chosen 3 examples, are such that unless they are very finely tuned, there is no possibility of life in our universe. And what it then looks like is like if you flip a coin 100 times and you keep getting heads, then you think to yourself, there's something rigged here. Of course, it could have happened by chance. There must be a point in which someone might be able to do that. But that's incredibly unlikely. And our world is even more like that. It's like all of these constants are so finely tuned to permit life that it forces us to that conclusion. Well, there must be somebody behind this all. We can't have all of these constants rigged in order to support life. There must be somebody controlling all of these things. So, what explains all this? And so we go back to our argument, and we said that the apparent fine-tuning of the universe either happened by chance, necessity, or purposive design. In order to get to a designer, we need to rule out chance and necessity. And I think it's fairly easy to rule out necessity, that the world needs to be the way it is, because we would all agree that our world doesn't need to be this way. It could have ended up in a hypothetically different kind of universe, where there isn't oxygen, where there isn't water to sustain life, where the gravitational constant doesn't support the right kind of stars, where the strong nuclear force doesn't support the right kind of elements to produce oxygen. And so we could quite easily be in a different universe. We wouldn't live in it. We wouldn't be there. But there could quite easily be another universe. So the next question is, did it happen by chance? Could it be a pure accident that the universe has ended up the way it has? My coin toss example tried to show that that would be a bit of a stretch. It would be wildly improbable. But this is where a lot of people actually stake their hopes, that this all just happened by chance. And to support this idea, some people then invoke the idea of a multiverse. And a multiverse kind of tries to fix that problem by saying that actually there's an infinite number of universes that exist. And in such a scenario, that means that every kind of possible tweak you can imagine exists in a universe somewhere. So that means that there must be a universe somewhere like ours, the one that we live in, where everything just happens to have emerged just the right way. But we saw last time that this idea of an actual infinity doesn't make sense. You cannot have an actual infinity. Conceptually, infinity works, but an actual infinity cannot exist. So you can't have an actual infinite number of universes. More to the point, the idea of multiverse is a speculative idea. There's no evidence for multiverses lots and lots of multiverses existing with different laws that exist in our own universe, that different constants exist in our own universes. Now, there are some physicists that work in quantum physics that talk about the idea of parallel universes, but the kinds of universes they talk about are the kinds of universes that have the same physical laws and the same physical constants as our own universe. So it's important to be aware that some physicists might talk about parallel universes. They don't mean the same thing as this, and it doesn't solve the problem of design. So then there's another objection which people might raise. So they say, okay, we can't have a multiverse or an infinite number of universes to solve our chance problem. So they invoke what's known as the anthropic principle. The point is, if the universe wasn't the way that it currently is, then you wouldn't be around to ask questions about why it exists. Therefore, you don't even need to ask those questions. You shouldn't bother asking the question, because otherwise, if the universe wasn't the way it is, well, you wouldn't be here to ask those questions. Let me give you an example. Imagine you're in a car crash. Your car rolls over and you suddenly realize that you're alive. And you step out of the car and you discover that you are alive. It's wildly improbable that you survived that car crash, but you're alive. And so you don't need to ask about why it was wildly improbable. You just need to know that you're alive. And so the anthropic principle comes along and says, well, you don't need to ask why we're here. We're just here. That just happens to be the way it is. And so there's no other explanation necessary. But I think we need to push back on that a little bit and say that the anthropic principle doesn't actually answer the question. It doesn't answer that tough question of why do we live in this carefully designed universe. Douglas Groothuis is a Christian philosopher, and he gives us this wonderful example. Imagine you have been arrested by a dictator in a foreign country. You've gone on your holidays, and unfortunately, you've been arrested, and you have been sentenced to death by a firing squad. And so these marksmen get you together into the courtyard, and they line up their guns. And you hear the commander saying, "Ready, aim, fire!" And you hear the explosion of 10 guns. But you feel no pain. You look at yourself and you see no injuries. And the soldier, he looks at you and he says, well, why are you so surprised? if they'd all hit you, you wouldn't be here to wonder why you were still alive. And Douglas Groothuis says, well, actually, that explanation is irrelevant. Of course, if they'd hit you, then you wouldn't be there to wonder why, but it doesn't answer the question of why they all missed. And the same way, when it comes to trying to understand the design of the universe, it doesn't do any good to say, well, of course we are in this universe. There's no point in asking the question of why we exist in this finely tuned universe, because otherwise we wouldn't be here to ask the question. It doesn't answer the question of why do we exist in such a finely tuned universe. It's like, again, being put in front of this firing squad, and they all fire, they all miss. Got to ask, why did that happen? It doesn't need to be this way. It's not something that could happen by chance. So why is it this way? It's got to be a designer. But this fine-tuning argument, I've presented it from the physical world and physics, but you can also see the evidence for design within the biological world as well. Remember back to the start of our talk when I talked about Charles Darwin, and he believed that he had found this law that explained why things look designed but they aren't. He says the law of natural selection explains that if you've got an environment that exists, then objects inevitably adapt to that environment so that it looks like they're designed for that environment, but actually they've just adapted to the environment that they're in. It's not design, it just looks like design. But we need to think about whether or not that's the full story. And specifically, I want to think about this idea of irreducible complexity. There's a biologist in the States, an academic biologist, Michael Behe, and he's been at the forefront of this work arguing for irreducible complexity. And his point here is that there's some biological systems that are so complex, you can't just arrive at them through adding on bits and pieces. They're irreducibly complex. They work as a unit. They don't just happen because one bit came along as one adaptation and then another change in the environment happened and then another bit got added on in order to fit the organism for the environment. And one of the key examples used in this literature is the bacterial flagellum. The bacterial flagellum is basically like your outboard motor of a bacterial cell. Imagine your boat. You want your boat to travel through the water. You get an outboard motor, you attach it to it, and that's what you need in order to propel it through the water. The bacterial flagellum works in the same way. It's got that little tail, the filament, that spins round and round and propels the bacterium through moisture. The point about this is that you cannot just have bits added on. It works as a unit. You've got that tail, you've got the hook that attaches it, you've got the motor, you've got the stators which keep it in place. And all of this is necessary in order for it to function. Without those pieces, it doesn't function properly. And it's not the kind of thing that can just adapt over time. And so you cannot just get a little bacteria and put it in an environment and expect that over millions or even billions of years it will just develop a flagellum. This is something which comes as a package. It's a motor that's attached to the cell. And so Behe's point is not that there isn't adaptation of organisms to the environment. He concedes that point. Organisms do adapt to their environment. His point, too, would concede that sometimes things look like they might be designed when actually it's just an adaptation to the environment. Fair enough. But does that explain everything? No, it doesn't. Because there's things within nature which are irreducibly complex. And it's not just something like with flagellum, something like DNA. The DNA in our cells is this language which tells our cells how to construct amino acids into proteins that act as the machines within the cell. And All the information that's needed to construct a human being is held within that DNA, which is a language like no other, a language which has been interpreted by scientists. And if we discovered such a detailed instruction manual anywhere else, we would say, someone designed this, someone wrote this. And yet, when we look into the contents of the cell and we see this DNA giving the exact instructions for how to make every single organism, including how to make a human being, and then step away and say, well, this DNA just happened by chance, that doesn't ring true. It's something which bears the evidence of design. Why do we find it so difficult to arrive at that conclusion? And this has been the claim of a movement known as the intelligent design movement, who have argued that there's evidence in biology for life being designed by an intelligent designer. And this has been vigorously criticized by many other biologists and is not widely accepted in the academy, precisely because scientists work on the principle of methodological naturalism, which to some extent makes sense. Like, if you discover that a cell has broken apart, for example, well, you don't just say, well, I don't know what happened, I'll just say that God did it. And so methodological naturalism works on the assumption that we've got to find natural causes for what happens in the natural world. We don't invoke external agencies to explain, God or a God did such and such a thing in the environment. We've got to find natural causes. And so this is why biology largely pushes against the intelligent design movement and says that actually this is a God of the gaps explanation. You can't figure out how it happened, therefore you're going to say, well, God did it. And I can understand that criticism, but the thing about the intelligent design movement and the arguments they're making is that they're not arguing from gaps. They're not saying, well, we just don't understand how something like the flagellum could have evolved over millions of years. It's positive evidence that they've got. Things like DNA, things like the bacterial flagellum. And they're saying, well, it's not just we don't have gaps in our understanding. We're saying that actually there's evidence, positive evidence, that this has been carefully designed. And it's only the philosophical assumptions of scientists that prevent them from arriving at that conclusion. And so if we concede that there could be a designer, then there's no obstacles to saying that this world that we see around us, that the biological systems that we see around us have been carefully designed. So where does this leave us? Well, it leaves us with the conclusion that the life that we live, the world that we live in, the universe that we live in, has been carefully designed, and it hasn't been an accident, but has been designed by a designer. Some people don't like this. This guy, Richard Dawkins, you've probably heard of him before, famous new atheist. And he doesn't like this fine-tuning argument. He says the theist says that God, when setting up the universe, tuned the fundamental constants of the universe so that each one lay in its Goldilocks zone. You know, Goldilocks, she wanted her porridge just right. Well, he's saying, he's got this idea of each physical constant being tuned to its Goldilocks zone so it's just right for the production of life. It's as though God had knobs that he could twiddle, and he carefully tuned each knob to its Goldilocks value. As ever, the theist's answer is deeply unsatisfying because it leaves the existence of God unexplained. And so the reason why he doesn't like this fine-tuning argument, he says, because, well, it doesn't explain where God came from. And we saw, well, last time when we talked about the existence of God, if God is a self-existent being, it's nonsensical to say, well, where did God come from? Self-existent beings don't have a starting point. That's the very point. So Dawkins' question doesn't actually make sense. But it also doesn't make sense on another level, because even if you don't explain everything, it doesn't take away from the value of the explanation you provided. So let me give you an example of that. Say you find this watch on the ground, and you find a watch on the ground, and you say, well, this is evidence that a designer has made this watch. And your friend comes up to you and says, well, that's not a very good explanation. It doesn't say anything about who created the designer. Well, you can see that that doesn't make any sense, because your explanation might not answer all of the questions, but it has answered the question. So even so, when it comes to invoking God as an explanation for the fine-tuning and the design of our universe, you might not have all the answers about who this God is or how he's done everything. And you might have residual questions, but you've still answered the question. And so Dawkins' objection is just trying to deny the conclusion that actually God works as the best explanation for the fine-tuning of our universe. It's far simpler to say that God designed this universe, the life that we live, than to say it all happened by chance or some other ad hoc explanation. But like last time, when I said that the cosmological argument only takes you so far, it doesn't take you the full way to actually saying who this God is. Even so, with the design argument, it takes you to the point of saying, well, there's an intelligent designer. It doesn't force you to the conclusion that actually this intelligent designer is God or the Christian God. But one of the most important points about intelligent design is that it points to an intelligence. If this world is carefully designed, if our biology is carefully designed, there's an intelligent being behind it. And this means it's not a blind, impersonal force. It means there's a personal, intelligent being who can be related to. And if there is a being who can be related to, who designed us, a personal being, an intelligent being, then it's our duty to try and get to know more about this being. But the remarkable claim about Christianity is not that this is a being who just kicked things off, designed everything, and then stood back to see how it would all pan out. But this is a being who has entered our universe, has entered into human existence itself. John writes in his gospel about this man that he came to know, Jesus of Nazareth. And he writes in his gospel, he was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. So here's a God who doesn't just design everything and step back. He's a God who designs everything and steps into human history, into human existence. A God who sees human beings turning against him and yet steps into creation in order to redeem them and call them back to himself and say that even though you've turned away, you can actually get to know me again. You can become a child of God. And so the call to recognize a designer, it's not just a call to accept some brute facts and say it's not chance, it's not necessity, it must be a designer, but you can't know anything about him. It's a call to recognize that there is an intelligent designer who's made this world, and he invites us to know him and to recognize our value as creatures who have been designed by him. Let me just wind up in prayer, and then if you've got any questions, I'll be happy to take any of those. Almighty God, we thank you that you are the God who has made us and has revealed yourself to us. We look at Scripture, we see what you say, and we love what you say to us. We look at this world around us, we see the majesty of creation, we see the ways in which our bodies are designed, and all of it impresses upon us that you are a God who wants us to know our value to you, that you've carefully designed us. And we look at Jesus, and we see that you're a God who comes to us and wants us to know that we've been designed for fellowship with you. And we pray that you would help us to live in such a way as to fulfill that potential that we have to be beings that can live in relationship with you. We ask this for Jesus' sake. Amen. Thank you for listening. Last time I asked for questions, I didn't get an awful lot of questions, so I'm just happy to take questions. Will I just take questions afterwards in general, or take now? Whatever. Does anybody have any burning questions they want to ask in front of everybody? Go on then.
So, do you think a lot of people try and or don't want to admit that there is a designer and a cosmic designer because of the implications of what that would mean for them if they did admit it?
See, yeah.
Or the questions that they then have to ask if they admit it, what does that mean for me?
Yeah. Because if you admit that there's a designer, admits that actually we're designed for something. This argument for design is also known as the teleological argument. That just means we've designed for a purpose. And then you've got to ask, well, what is that purpose? And that is a big question. And if we want to live for the purpose for which our designer has created us, then it means we don't actually get to call the shots about what we want to live for. That's how I would respond to that. Anybody else have a burning question? No, that's okay. I'll be hanging around here, obviously having tea and... Oh, you got a question, go ahead.
What is, you know the picture that you showed us about the army, what does that have to do with God?
The army. The army is, that example is to try and explain what's known as the anthropic principle. The anthropic principle, remind you again, is this idea that if the universe wasn't the way it is, finely tuned the way it is, then we wouldn't be here to ask, why are we here? And so the anthropic principle basically says, well, don't ask that question because it's a meaningless question. But what I was trying to show through that example of being shot by the 10 soldiers and discovering that actually you hadn't been shot is that to say, well, just because you're alive, that means that it's a meaningless question is actually incorrect. Because you've still got to ask for an explanation of why you haven't been killed. You should have been killed, but you haven't been. Same with the universe. We live in a universe which sustains our life, and we've got to ask the question, well, why? Why has it been so finely tuned? Okay, I'll wind up there, but I will be milling around. And if you've got any questions, happy to chat further.